The air in the gilded cage saloon was a foul stew of stale beer, cheap perfume, and the thick, cloying smoke of cigars. It was an atmosphere of casual despair, a place where men came to lose themselves and forget the unforgiving sun that beat down on the town of redemption. But tonight, the despair was not casual. It was a spectacle. In the center of the room, perched precariously on an overturned whiskey crate, stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 18 summers old. Her name was Ilara, though the man selling her refused to use it. To him, she was an asset, a line item in a ledger bound in cracked leather. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn at the shoulder, revealing a bruise the color of a dying plum. Dust and tear tracks mapped her pale cheeks, but her chin was held at an angle of defiance that seemed to cost her every last ounce of her strength. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, darted over the faces in the crowd, leering, indifferent, pitying, but all of them silent. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The man orchestrating this grim theater was Corbin Blackwood. He was a man whose wealth had been built on the misfortunes of others, a vulture who circled the dying dreams of homesteaders and ranchers. He was dressed in a tailored suit of black wool that defied the oppressive heat, a symbol of his separation from the dusty struggles of common men. He held the ledger like a holy book, one manicured finger tracing a line of debt. "Gentlemen," Blackwood's voice was smooth, oiled, and carried to every corner of the packed room. "We are gathered here for a matter of business, but let us not forget the heart. The late Mr. Thorne, a good man but a poor manager of funds, left this world with a considerable debt to my own humble enterprise." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "A debt that now falls upon the shoulders of his only living kin." He gestured to Ilara with a theatrical flourish, as if presenting a prized mare. "This young woman, healthy, strong-willed, and with a keen sense of duty, I'm sure, is in need of a position. A contract of indenture, to be precise. To work off her father's obligations. I am offering the winning bidder the full rights to that contract." The words indenture and contractor were thin veils for a much uglier truth, and every man in the room knew it. It was a slave auction with prettier language. A few of Blackwood's cronies, beefy men with cruel mouths and dull eyes, snickered and nudged each other. "I'll start the bidding at $20 for the contract," one of them shouted, his gaze crawling over Ilara's form. "25, yelled another, his voice thick with drink. Ilara swayed on the crate, her face losing what little color it had. The room began to spin, the jeering faces blurring into a vortex of malice. Her defiant posture crumbled, her shoulders slumping. Her gaze, now desperate and unfocused, continued its sweep of the room. It passed over the cowardly farmers who owed Blackwood money, over the grim-faced shopkeepers too afraid to intervene, over the hardened prospectors who had seen worse and didn't care. And then, her eyes found him. In the deepest, darkest corner of the saloon sat a man who seemed to be a part of the shadows themselves. He was weathered, his face a landscape of hard miles and quiet sorrows. A thick, untrimmed beard hid the set of his jaw, but it could not hide the intensity in his eyes. They were the color of faded denim, and they were fixed on her. He had not moved, had not spoken. He nursed a single glass of amber liquid, his large, calloused hands wrapped around it as if for warmth. He was a stranger, just another drifter passing through redemption. He had entered the saloon seeking only a moment's peace from the ghosts that rode with him, but had instead stumbled into a living nightmare. For a heartbeat, the cacophony of the auction faded into a dull roar. The stranger's eyes held hers, and in them, she saw not the pity or the lust or the fear that filled the rest of the room. She saw, or recognition. A shared understanding of pain. It was as if he were looking straight through her desperation and seeing the small, flickering ember of her will to survive. The connection broke as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The floor rushed up to meet her, the leering faces dissolving into blackness. She crumpled, fainting, and fell from the crate onto the dusty floorboards with a soft, final thud. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by a ripple of nervous laughter. Blackwood scowled, annoyed by the interruption to his performance. "Well," he sneered. "It seems the merchandise is a bit overwrought." Before he could say more, a voice cut through the saloon. It wasn't loud, but it had the gravelly weight of stone grinding against stone. It was a voice that hadn't been used for much talking, and it silenced the room instantly. "I have a bid." All heads turned towards the dark corner. The stranger had not risen. He had not moved a muscle, save for the lips that formed the words. His gaze was no longer on Elara, but was now fixed on Corbin Blackwood, a silent challenge that was as sharp and cold as a winter wind. Blackwood, momentarily thrown off balance, recovered with a smirk. "Well, well, a new player. And what is your name, friend?" The stranger ignored the question. His eyes flickered to the floor, where Elara lay still and vulnerable. "My bid is not in dollars." A murmur of confusion went through the crowd. Blackwood's smirk widened into a grin of pure arrogance. He saw a fool, a drifter with no money trying to play the hero. "Is that so? And what, pray tell, could you possibly possess that is worth more than hard currency in my town?" The stranger slowly, deliberately, reached down beside his chair. When his hand came back up, it was holding a rifle. But it was not just any rifle. It was a work of art. The stock was of a deep, rich walnut, polished to a soft sheen by years of careful handling. Intricate carvings of vines and leaves curled around the grip and along the forestock, the work of a master craftsman. The barrel was blued steel, gleaming even in the dim light. It was a beautiful, deadly thing, a rifle that spoke of a life and a history far beyond the dust of redemption. It was clearly the man's most prized, and perhaps only, possession of value. Even Blackwood's greedy eyes widened in appreciation. He was a collector of things, and this was a fine thing indeed. "That," the stranger said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is my bid." For a moment, Blackwood was silent, calculating. The rifle was worth far more than the petty sums being offered for the girl's contract. To take it would be a double victory. He would acquire a magnificent piece for his collection and further humiliate the girl by trading her for an object. The thought delighted his cruel sensibilities. "An unorthodox offer," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "But I am a man who appreciates quality. I will accept your bid." He slammed the ledger shut with a sound like a gunshot. "Sold. The contract belongs to the stranger." The tension in the room broke. The show was over. The stranger rose from his chair, his movements economical and deliberate. He was taller than he had appeared sitting down, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of hard labor. He walked towards the center of the room, the heavy rifle held loosely in one hand. The crowd parted for him, the men avoiding his gaze. He didn't look at Blackwood. He didn't look at anyone. He went straight to where Elara lay on the floor. He placed the rifle on a nearby table, a final, silent transfer of ownership. Then he knelt. With a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance, he gathered the unconscious girl into his arms. She was light, fragile as a broken bird. As he stood, cradling her against his chest, her head lolled against his shoulder. He turned and walked towards the swinging doors of the saloon, his worn boots making no sound on the floorboards. Just as he reached the threshold, Elara began to stir, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered open, her vision swimming back into focus. She found herself looking up at the stranger's bearded face, at the deep-set, sorrowful eyes. Fear and confusion warred within her. The stranger felt her stir. He paused in the doorway, the cool night air washing over them. He lowered his head slightly, and his voice, for her ears alone, was a low, rough whisper, not of stone on stone, but of dry earth, of promise. "You're not alone." And then he stepped out into the darkness, carrying her away from the gilded cage and into an uncertain future. What drives a man to trade everything he has for a stranger? What ghost from the past could compel such a sacrifice? If you were in that saloon, a witness to this quiet act of defiance, what would you have thought? Would you see a fool, or would you see a hero? The stranger, whose name no one yet knew, carried Elara through the deserted main street of redemption. He moved with a purpose that belied his ragged appearance, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. He bypassed the larger, more conspicuous hotel, his gaze scanning the quieter side streets until he found what he was looking for, a modest, two-story wooden building with a neatly painted sign that read Martha's Boarding House, clean rooms, no ruffians, a single lamp burned in a downstairs window, a beacon of humble decency in the morally bankrupt town. He kicked gently at the door, unable to use his hands. After a moment, the lock clicked and the door opened a crack, revealing a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and hair the color of spun silver. This was Martha, a widow who had seen more than her share of the town's sorrow and had somehow kept her heart from hardening. Her eyes widened at the sight of the large stranger holding the bruised, unconscious girl. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, swinging the door fully open. "Bring her in, son. Bring her in quick." The stranger, who called himself Silas, carried Elara into a small, immaculately clean parlor that smelled of lavender and wood soap. He laid her gently on a worn but comfortable settee. Martha was already in motion, bustling to fetch a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a jar of healing salve. She worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, her touch both firm and compassionate as she began to clean the dirt and grime from Elara's face. Silas stood back, a looming presence by the door, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He watched Martha tend to the girl, a strange, painful expression flickering in the depths of his eyes. It was a look of profound loss, a ghost of a memory superimposed over the present scene. He saw not Martha, but another woman, his wife, tending to a scraped knee on their small daughter. The memory was a knife twist in his gut, sharp and sudden. He flinched, his jaw tightening. "She'll need a room," he said, his voice rusty again. "For as long as she needs it." Martha glanced up at him, her gaze perceptive. She saw more than just a drifter, she saw a man carrying a burden heavier than the girl in his arms. "A room is $5 a week." In advance, Silas reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, thin roll of bills held together by a string. He carefully counted out $5, then another $5, and then all that was left, a few crumpled ones and some small coin. He placed the entire sum on a small table by the door. "This is all I have," he stated, not as a plea, but as a simple fact. "It'll have to be enough for now." Martha looked from the money to his face, then to the sleeping girl. She nodded slowly. "It will be enough. The room at the top of the stairs is ready. You can carry her up." After settling Elara into a small, clean room with a single bed and a handmade quilt, Silas retreated without another word. He did not take a room for himself. He returned to the street, melting back into the shadows from whence he came. He found his way to the livery stable, the scent of hay and horse a familiar comfort. He paid the stable boy a few of his last remaining coins to sleep in an empty stall, preferring the company of animals to that of men. The next morning, Sheriff Brody found him there. Brody was a man caught in the middle. He wore a badge, but it felt more like a target. He was a good man who presided over a town owned by a bad one. He was tall and lean, with a weary face and a drooping mustache that had seen too many sunrises after too many violent nights. He found Silas currying a horse that wasn't his movements rhythmic and soothing. "The whole town's talking," Brody said, his voice low and even. He leaned against the stall door, not reaching for his gun, but keeping his hand near it. "They're saying a ghost walked into the gilded cage last night and bought a girl's freedom with a rifle fit for a king." Silas didn't stop his work. "I'm no ghost, no," Brody agreed. "Ghosts don't leave tracks. And you, friend, are leaving some mighty big ones. You humiliated Corbin Blackwood in front of his men. That's not something a man like him forgets. He thinks you stole his property." "She ain't property," Silas grunted, his brushstrokes becoming harder. "Maybe not to you and me," the sheriff sighed, "but the law in this territory is a funny thing. That indenture contract was legal, if not right. Blackwood could make a lot of trouble for you." For the girl, Silas finally stopped his work and turned to face the lawman. His eyes were cold and clear. He can try. Sheriff Brody held his gaze for a long moment, trying to read the man before him. He saw no fear, only a deep, settled resolve that was more intimidating than any outlaw's bravado. "Who are you, mister? What's your business in redemption?" "Just passing through," Silas said, the lie thin and worn. Brody grunted, a sound of cynical disbelief. "People who are just passing through don't sell a $500 rifle for a girl they don't know." You bought yourself a fight you didn't need to pick. Maybe I did, Silas said, turning back to the horse. The conversation was over. Brody, knowing he could get no more, pushed himself off the stall. For what it's worth, he said to Silas's back, I'm glad you did what you did. But gladness don't stop bullets. You watch your back. Over the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over the town. Silas kept to himself, working odd jobs at the livery for his keep, sleeping in the hayloft. He was a silent sentinel. He never approached the boarding house directly, but Ilara would often catch a glimpse of him from her window, watching from across the street, a solitary figure leaning against a wall, ensuring she was safe. At Martha's, Ilara slowly began to heal. The bruises on her skin started to fade, but the wounds within were deeper. Martha's kindness was a balm, a steady presence that asked for nothing in return. She talked to Ilara not about the auction or her father's debts, but about simple things, the best way to bake bread, the names of the wildflowers that grew on the edge of town. It was in these quiet moments that Ilara's own resilience began to surface. She was not broken, merely bent. One afternoon, while helping Martha hang laundry in the small yard behind the boarding house, she saw Silas in the alleyway behind the stable. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, a whetstone in one hand and a long hunting knife in the other. He drew the blade across the stone with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, his focus absolute. His hands, she noticed, were a roadmap of his life, scarred and calloused from work and from violence, yet they moved with a surgeon's precision. She hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked towards him, a glass of water in her hand. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. He was like a wolf, always alert, always sensing the world around him. She stopped a few feet away, holding out the glass. You look thirsty, she said, her voice soft but clear. He finally stopped sharpening the blade and lifted his head. His eyes, in the bright sunlight, were even more startling, filled with a history she couldn't guess. He looked at the glass, then at her face. He took the water, his rough fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting instant. He drank it all in one long swallow, his throat working. He handed the empty glass back to her. Thank you, he rumbled. It was the first time he had spoken to her since that terrible night. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the sound of the distant blacksmith's hammer. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. Who are you? Why did you help me? What are you running from? But she knew he wouldn't answer. The walls around him were too high, too thick. So instead of asking, she spoke. My father, she began, her voice trembling slightly, he wasn't a bad man. He was just hopeful. He thought Blackwood was helping him, giving him a loan to buy more seed after the drought. He didn't understand that the contract was a trap. Blackwood doesn't just want money. He likes to own people. He likes to see their hope die. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the knife in his hands. He said nothing, but she could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. He understood. He understood the kind of evil that sought not just to defeat a man, but to extinguish his spirit. He had seen it before. That night, as he lay in the hayloft, the ghosts came for him again. Not in a dream, but in a waking vision. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid. The crackle of timber turning to ash. The sound of a woman's scream, his wife's name on his lips, a name he no longer allowed himself to speak. He saw the face of his little girl, her eyes wide with terror, framed by a window of fire. He had been too late. A raiding party, drunk on whiskey and cruelty, had set his ranch ablaze for sport. He had fought them, but he couldn't fight the flames. He had failed to protect them. And that failure had burned itself into his soul, leaving him a hollowed-out shell of the man he once was. He had been drifting ever since, running from the smoke, running from their faces. He had changed his name, shed his past like a snake sheds its skin. But a man can't run from his own heart. In Ilara's wide, terrified eyes in that saloon, he had seen the same vulnerability, the same innocence he had failed to save. And something inside him, a long-dormant piece of the man he used to be, had stirred. He hadn't saved her for her. He had saved her for them. It wasn't charity. It was penance. He had given up his rifle, the last beautiful thing from his old life, to try and balance the scales of his own soul. He had traded a memory of his past for a chance to redeem it. This quiet, wounded man had bought himself a war, not with money, but with the last remnants of his own broken heart. He had no plan, no allies, only the weight of a failure he was desperate to correct. What would you do if you were him? When faced with the architect of your past pain, would you cling to the shadows, or would you finally step into the light and fight? Corbin Blackwood was not a man who tolerated public slights. The quiet defiance of the stranger named Silas was a festering wound to his pride. The story of the auction had spread through Redemption and the surrounding territories like a prairie fire, and in every telling, Blackwood was made to look the fool, outmaneuvered by a silent drifter. His power was built on a foundation of fear, and fear, once cracked, can crumble. He decided it was time to remind the town, and this upstart stranger, who held the real power. He sent 3 of his hired thugs to the livery stable late one night. They were not subtle men. They were brutes who solved problems with fists and boots. They found Silas in the hayloft, seemingly asleep. Blackwood wants a word, the leader, a hulking man with a flattened nose, sneered. He also wants his property back. The girl. You're gonna walk away, drifter. Or you ain't gonna walk at all. Silas didn't open his eyes. Tell your boss the girl stays where she is. The men chuckled, spreading out to surround him. Wrong answer. The leader lunged, aiming a kick at Silas's ribs. But he was kicking at empty air. In a movement too fast to follow, Silas had rolled away and come to his feet in a low crouch. He wasn't a brawler, he was a survivor. His movements were brutally efficient, stripped of all wasted motion. He didn't throw wild punches. He struck with the palm of his hand at a man's nose, sending him staggering back with a cry of pain and a spray of blood. He used an elbow to shatter the collarbone of the second man who rushed him. The third, the leader, pulled a knife, but Silas was already inside his guard, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist with crushing force. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the knife clattered to the floor. The fight was over in less than a minute. Silas stood breathing heavily over the 3 groaning men. He hadn't killed them, but he had systematically and painfully dismantled them. He left them broken, not just in body, but in spirit, their bravado shattered. He wanted the message sent back to Blackwood to be clear: I am not afraid, and I am more dangerous than you know. News of the one-sided fight electrified the town. The people of Redemption had seen Blackwood's thugs brutalize debtors and bully shopkeepers for years. To see them so utterly defeated by one silent man was a shock to the system. Fear of Blackwood began to curdle into a dangerous, unfamiliar hope. Ilara heard the story from Martha, who had heard it from the blacksmith. She looked out her window and saw Silas standing across the street, his posture unchanged, his vigil unbroken. But now, she saw him differently. She was not afraid of the violence she heard he was capable of. She understood it was a shield, a wall he had built to protect a deeply wounded core. That afternoon, she baked a small loaf of bread, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and walked across the street to him. He was leaning against the general store, watching the comings and goings of the town. He saw her approach and straightened up, his guarded expression softening almost imperceptibly. I heard what happened, she said, holding out the bread. This is for you. He took the offering, the warmth of the loaf seeping into his calloused hands. You shouldn't have, he said, his voice low. It ain't safe for you to be seen with me. I'm not afraid of him, she replied, her own voice gaining a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Not anymore. What you did, it made me realize that men like him only have the power we give them. When we stop being afraid, they become small. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the terrified victim from the saloon, but a resilient young woman with a core of steel. She reminded him so fiercely of his wife, of her quiet strength and unyielding spirit. He won't stop, Silas warned. Men like him never do. This has become about more than just you. I know, she said. It's about the whole town. It's about what's right. Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the street. Corbin Blackwood himself, flanked by 2 new, meaner-looking guards, rode into town. He reined his magnificent black stallion to a halt directly in front of them. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with hatred as he looked at Silas. But then his gaze shifted, and he held up the beautiful, hand-carved rifle Silas had traded him. He held it aloft for the whole town to see. A fine piece of craftsmanship, Blackwood sneered, his voice carrying an edge of triumph. A truly magnificent weapon. I had my associates in the capital make some inquiries about the unique carvings on this stock. He paused, letting the tension build, his eyes locking onto Silas's. They told me it belonged to a rancher from the Cimarron territory. A man who lost everything in a fire a few years back. A man who lost his wife and his little girl. Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was somehow more chilling than a shout. A man named Jedediah. The name struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. A name he had buried, a name that belonged to a different man, a man with a home and a family and a future. He visibly flinched, the color draining from his face. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart crumbled to dust. The crowd, which had gathered at a safe distance, gasped. Sheriff Brody, standing in the doorway of his office, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He finally understood the depth of the stranger's pain, and the cruelty of Blackwood's game. Elara looked from Blackwood's triumphant, monstrous face to the man beside her. She saw the raw agony in his eyes, the mask of the stoic protector stripped away to reveal the haunted soul of Jedediah. All the pieces fell into place, the sorrow, the silent vigil, the desperate act of sacrifice. It wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. Blackwood smiled, a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "That's right," he said, savoring the moment. "I know who you are, Jedediah. You're not a ghost. You're just a failure. A man who couldn't even save his own family. And you thought you could save this little stray." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the sudden silence of the street. "You are nothing." The sleeping giant was awake now, and the ghosts of his past were no longer just memories. They stood beside him in the dusty street, their spectral faces demanding a final reckoning. The sky above Redemption began to darken, not with the setting sun, but with the bruised purple of an approaching storm. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken promise of violence. Corbin Blackwood, his face still twisted in a triumphant sneer, delivered his ultimatum. "Jedediah," he spat the name like a curse. "By sundown, you will be gone from my town. Or you will be buried in it. And I will take the girl. She is my property, and I always collect what is mine." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his guards following like carrion birds. The townspeople, who had been watching with a mixture of fear and fascination, scattered back into the safety of their homes and shops. Doors were bolted, shutters were closed. They had seen the spark of defiance, but now they saw the coming fire, and they wanted no part of it. Jedediah stood alone in the center of the street, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. The mask of Silas was gone forever, and the raw, exposed grief of the man he used to be was a terrible weight. Elara took a hesitant step toward him, her hand outstretched. "Jedediah," she whispered. He flinched, turning his face away. "Don't," he rasped, his voice thick with pain. "Don't call me that." He turned and walked away, not looking back, his broad shoulders slumped under an invisible load. He didn't go to the livery. He walked to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The smith, a burly man with kind eyes, stopped his work as Jedediah entered. "Heard what Blackwood said?" the smith grunted. "You need a gun?" Jedediah shook his head. His eye scanned the tools hanging on the wall, the tongs, the files, the rasps. They settled on a heavy, perfectly balanced forging hammer with a short, thick handle. It was not a weapon of finesse. It was an instrument of brute force, made for shaping iron and steel. "I need this," Jedediah said, his voice regaining some of its stony resolve. He placed his last few coins on the anvil. The smith looked at the pittance, then at the storm in Jedediah's eyes. He pushed the coins back. "No charge," he said. "Use it well." With the hammer hanging from a loop in his belt, Jedediah went to the boarding house one last time. He found Martha and Elara in the parlor, their faces etched with worry. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway, a figure framed against the darkening sky. "Stay inside," he said, his gaze on Elara. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." His eyes held hers for a long moment, an entire conversation passing between them without a word. It was a promise, a farewell, an apology. He was not just fighting for her, he was fighting for the memory of those he had lost, a final, desperate attempt to silence the ghosts. He turned to leave, but Elara's voice stopped him. "Jedediah." He paused, his back to her. "Their names were Sarah and Rose," she said softly, her voice filled with a profound empathy that cut through his armor of grief. She was giving him back his past, not as a source of pain, but as a source of strength. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then walked out into the gathering dusk. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery shades of red and orange, the first drops of rain began to fall. They hissed on the hot dust of the street. Blackwood and 6 of his men rode back into town. They were armed with rifles and pistols, their faces grim. They saw Jedediah standing alone in the middle of the square, the blacksmith's hammer in his hand. Suddenly, another figure stepped out of the sheriff's office. It was Brody, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "This is as far as you go, Corbin," Brody said, his voice steady. "There'll be no killing in my town tonight." Blackwood laughed, a sound as ugly as a vulture's cry. "Your town? You're just a hired hand, Brody." "Stand aside." No, before Brody could even raise the shotgun, one of Blackwood's men, positioned on a nearby rooftop, fired. The shot wasn't meant to kill, but to disable. The bullet tore through Brody's shoulder, sending him sprawling into the mud. The fight had begun. The thugs dismounted, spreading out, advancing on Jedediah from all sides. He didn't wait for them. He charged, not at the men in front of him, but towards the narrow alley between the general store and the saloon. It was a calculated move, forcing them to follow him into the tight space, where their numbers would mean less. The ensuing battle was a symphony of brutal, close-quarters combat. Jedediah moved with the desperate grace of a cornered bear. He used the alley's darkness and clutter to his advantage. He swung the heavy hammer not wildly, but with precise, bone-shattering force. A man's knee, an elbow, a jaw. He fought in silence, the only sounds the grunts of pain from his opponents, the crack of bone, and the steady, drumming rain. He took blows, a knife slash across his arm, a fist to his face that split his lip, but he barely seemed to notice. He was fueled by a grief so profound it had become a source of terrible strength. One by one, Blackwood's men went down, left writhing in the mud-slicked alley. Finally, only Blackwood himself remained. He stood in the town square, his fine suit now spattered with mud, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He fumbled for his pistol, his hand shaking uncontrollably in the pouring rain. Jedediah emerged from the alley, a fearsome silhouette against the lightning that split the sky. He was bruised, bleeding, and soaked to the bone, but he was unbroken. He walked slowly, deliberately towards Blackwood. Blackwood finally managed to raise his pistol and fire. The shot went wide, kicking up mud a foot to Jedediah's left. Before he could fire again, Jedediah was on him. He didn't use the hammer. His hand shot out and grabbed Blackwood's wrist, twisting it with savage force. The pistol clattered into a puddle. With his other hand, he seized Blackwood by the throat, lifting him off his feet. Blackwood's eyes bulged with terror, his legs kicking uselessly. In that moment, with the tyrant's life in his hands, Jedediah saw them. Sarah. Rose. Their faces shimmered in the rain, their eyes pleading. They were not asking for vengeance. They were asking for peace. He then saw Elara's face, her eyes filled not with fear but with a defiant hope. He looked into Blackwood's terrified eyes and saw not a monster, but a pathetic, cowardly man. Killing him would be an execution, not a victory. It would not bring back his family. It would only tether him to their ghosts forever. With a roar that was part rage, part sorrow, part release, he hurled Blackwood away from him. The man landed in a heap in the mud. Jedediah stood over him, his chest heaving. He looked at Blackwood's gun hand, the hand that had signed the predatory contracts, the hand that had tried to kill him. He raised his own foot and brought it down with all his weight. A sickening crunch echoed through the square. Blackwood screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony as the bones in his hand shattered. Jedediah turned his back on the weeping, broken man and walked away, leaving him to the rain and the mud and the ruin of his own making. Dawn broke over Redemption, clear and crisp. The storm had passed, washing the dust from the streets and the fear from the air. The town looked new, reborn. Slowly, tentatively, the people emerged from their homes. They saw the groaning, injured thugs being helped by their remaining compatriots. They saw Sheriff Brody, his arm in a sling, being tended to by Martha. And they saw Corbin Blackwood, his face a mess of mud and tears, his hand a mangled wreck, being helped onto a horse by a grim-faced ranch hand. His reign was over. The fear he had cultivated for so long had been washed away in a single night of violent rain. Jedediah stood alone in the center of the square, the rising sun warming his bruised face. The blacksmith's hammer lay on the ground beside him. He was exhausted, aching in every bone and muscle, but the frantic energy of the ghosts had subsided. They were still with him, but they were quiet now, resting. The crushing weight on his soul had lessened, replaced by a profound, weary peace. He had not found vengeance. He had found something far more precious, absolution. The door of the boarding house opened, and Elara stepped out. She walked directly to him, her steps sure and steady. She didn't cry or offer words of thanks. The moment was too sacred for that. She carried a small basin of water and a clean cloth. She stopped in front of him and, with a tenderness that mirrored his own gentleness on the night he had rescued her, she began to clean the cut on his lip. "Jedediah," she said, her voice soft but firm. She used his real name, not as an accusation, but as an anointing. It was an acknowledgement of all he had been through, and an acceptance of the man he was now. He didn't pull away. For the first time, the name didn't feel like a brand of failure. It just felt like his name. He looked down at her strong, capable hands, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. And for the first time since the fire, his own eyes were clear. The haunted, faraway look was gone, replaced by a simple, profound presence. "Elara," he replied, his voice rough but steady. It was the first time he had said her name. Sheriff Brody walked over, his good arm holding a familiar leather-bound ledger. He nodded at Jedediah, a new respect in his eyes. "Blackwood and his men are gone for good," he said. "I suspect they won't be back. This ledger you somehow liberated from the saloon will be very interesting to the circuit judge. It seems Blackwood wasn't just a predator, he was a common cheat." He paused, looking at Jedediah's bruised knuckles and the quiet power radiating from him. "As for you, I was unconscious for the whole affair. All I saw was a man defending himself against a dozen armed thugs." He gestured with his chin towards the smithy. "The blacksmith's assistant quit last week. Said the work was too hard. A strong man could find steady work there. A man looking to build something, instead of just passing through. It was more than a job offer. It was an offer of a life, a place in the community he had unwittingly saved." Jedediah looked from the sheriff to Elara, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. He then looked to the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher, bathing the small town in a warm, hopeful light. The road still called to him, the open country promising the lonely freedom he had grown accustomed to. But for the first time in years, the thought of staying in one place did not feel like a cage. It felt like a foundation. He had arrived in Redemption as a ghost, a man running from a past he could not escape. He had faced the specter of his failure and, in an act of selfless protection, had transformed it into a monument of redemption. He had not brought back the dead, but he had given life and hope to the living. And in doing so, he had finally saved himself. Jedediah chose mercy over vengeance, and in protecting another, he finally healed himself. What do you believe is the truest path to redemption, justice for the past, or building a better future? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. For more stories that inspire the heart and stir the soul, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel.